In the spring of 1943, a British officer walked into a briefing room in Cairo and the other men fell silent. They called him Dead Man Walking, not as an insult but as a statement of statistical certainty. Major Vladimir Peniakov had already survived missions that killed entire squadrons. He had walked out of ambushes that should have buried him in the sand, and he was about to do it again. This is the story of Popsky's Private Army, the most unconventional unit of World War II, and the man who led them through 12 operations that military planners considered suicide missions. Every single time, he came back. By 1942, the North African campaign had become a war of movement, deception, and desperate gambles. The vast desert between Libya and Egypt stretched for hundreds of miles. When Insasabaoans and Priens would flee, a landscape so hostile that entire armies could vanish into it. Conventional forces clashed in set-piece battles at El Alamein and Tobruk, but between these major engagements, a different kind of warfare emerged. Small, highly mobile units began operating deep behind enemy lines, striking at supply depots, airfields, and communication networks. The Long-Range Desert Group had pioneered this approach. The Special Air Service refined it. But one man would take it further than anyone thought possible. Vladimir Peniakov was born in Belgium in 1897 to Russian parents. Educated at Cambridge, he had served in the First World War and later made his fortune as a sugar manufacturer in Egypt. When war broke out again in 1939, he was in his early 40s, spoke 5 languages fluently, and knew the North African desert better than most career soldiers. He volunteered for the British Army despite being well past the normal age for combat service. The British military establishment had no idea what to do with him. Peniakov had no interest in following standard procedures. He proposed something radical, a self-contained raiding force of hand-picked men, operating with complete independence, targeting objectives too dangerous or too remote for regular units. In October 1942, after months of persistence, he received authorization to form what would officially be designated No. 1 Demolition Squadron. Everyone else called it Popsky's Private Army. Proving ground at Kufra. The first mission came in November 1942, during the immediate aftermath of the Second Battle of El Alamein. While Rommel's Afrika Korps retreated westward across Libya, British forces pursued but struggled to cut off the withdrawal. Peniakov received orders to penetrate 200 miles behind enemy lines and destroy a critical fuel dump near Kufra Oasis. Military intelligence estimated he had a 30% chance of reaching the target and less than 10% of returning. Peniakov selected 11 men, loaded 3 trucks with weapons, explosives, and enough supplies for 3 weeks, and drove straight into territory controlled by the Germans and Italians. The route took them through terrain considered impassable. They navigated by stars, avoided known enemy positions, and moved primarily at night. On the 6th day, they encountered an Italian patrol. Rather than retreat, Peniakov attacked immediately, capturing the patrol's vehicles and using them to approach the fuel dump disguised as an Axis convoy. The raid itself lasted 17 minutes. They destroyed over 50,000 gallons of aviation fuel, demolished the storage facilities, and disappeared back into the desert before reinforcements arrived. All 12 men returned to base. The success was so unexpected that British headquarters initially suspected the reports were exaggerated. They were not. The Railroad Sabotage Campaign. By early 1943, the strategic situation had shifted. Allied forces had landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch, and now German and Italian armies in North Africa faced pressure from both east and west. The Axis forces relied heavily on a single railroad running along the Tunisian coast to move supplies and reinforcements. Sisawar to State. Breaking this supply line became a strategic priority. Conventional bombing raids had limited success. The track could be repaired within hours. What was needed was sustained, unpredictable sabotage that would force the enemy to divert thousands of troops to guard hundreds of miles of vulnerable infrastructure. Peniakov proposed a series of raids targeting not just the track itself, but the switching stations, water towers, and maintenance facilities that kept the railroad operational. Between February and April 1943, Popsky's Private Army conducted 4 separate deep penetration missions into Tunisia. Each time, they traveled light, carried minimal supplies, and relied on speed and surprise rather than firepower. The second mission nearly ended in disaster when they were spotted by a German reconnaissance aircraft. But Peniakov ordered his vehicles to scatter and rendezvous at a predetermined location 70 miles away. For 3 days, the unit operated as independent 2-man teams hunted by enemy patrols. All of them made it to the rendezvous. They completed the mission the following night. The Italian campaign, behind the Gothic Line. When Allied forces invaded Italy in September 1943, Peniakov's unit transitioned from desert warfare to mountain operations. The challenges multiplied. In North Africa, visibility stretched for miles, and concealment meant distance. In the Italian Apennines, every valley could hide an ambush, every village might be garrisoned, and the locals could be either partisans or informers. The Gothic Line, Germany's primary defensive position across northern Italy, stretched from the Ligurian Sea to the Adriatic. So, breaking through required not just frontal assault, but intelligence about German positions, supply routes, and reserve deployments. Between October 1943 and March 1944, Popsky's private army operated continuously behind the Gothic Line. Mission 5 involved a 50-mile infiltration to identify German artillery positions threatening the British 8th Army's advance. Mission 6 targeted a bridge that carried supplies to 3 German divisions. Peniakov and 8 men reached the bridge, placed demolition charges, and were extracting when a German convoy arrived unexpectedly. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. They detonated the charges as they withdrew, collapsing the bridge and destroying 4 supply trucks. 1 man was wounded. The rest made it back to Allied lines after a 4-day march through enemy territory. Yama's 7th mission almost killed him. Peniakov was tasked with establishing contact with Italian partisan groups operating in the mountains west of Rimini. The intelligence was faulty, the partisans had been compromised, and German counterintelligence had set a trap. Peniakov walked into an ambush that should have ended with his capture or death. Instead, he killed 2 German soldiers with his pistol, escaped into the forest, and survived alone for 9 days before reconnecting with Allied forces. He lost 20 pounds and nearly lost his left foot to frostbite. He was back on operations within 3 weeks, operating in chaos. By late 1944, the strategic focus had shifted to the Balkans. As German forces began withdrawing from Greece, they left behind a chaotic mixture of collaborationist militias, communist partisans, royalist resistance groups, and isolated Wehrmacht units uncertain whether to surrender or fight on. British strategic planners needed intelligence on who controlled what territory, where German forces remained concentrated, and which resistance groups could be trusted. This required someone willing to operate in an environment where yesterday's ally might be tomorrow's enemy, and where the greatest danger often came not from Germans, but from the tangled politics of Greek resistance movements. Mission 8 sent Peniakov into central Greece to assess the military capabilities of Elis, the communist-controlled resistance army. He spent 3 weeks moving between partisan camps, evaluating their equipment, leadership, and intentions. The mission required diplomatic skill as much as military competence. Peniakov discovered that Elis was preparing not to fight Germans but to seize control of Greece after liberation. His reports influenced British policy and helped prevent a larger civil war, though conflict would come regardless. Missions 9 and 10 took place in rapid succession during November and December 1944. Both involved locating German units that had gone to ground in remote mountain areas and either forcing their surrender or marking their positions for airstrikes. The 9th mission succeeded without casualties. The 10th nearly failed when Peniakov's convoy was caught in a snowstorm and stranded for 4 days without shelter. They survived by abandoning their vehicles and marching to a village that turned out to be held by a company of German mountain troops. Peniakov bluffed his way through, and it got Mawan to power about claiming to be a liaison officer with a much larger British force nearby. The German commander, exhausted and isolated, chose to believe him and surrendered his entire company rather than risk a battle he might not win. The final missions. The 11th and 12th missions took place in Austria during the final weeks of the war in Europe. By April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing, but isolated German units continued fighting with desperate intensity. Peniakov's orders were to locate and secure documents related to German intelligence operations in the Balkans before they could be destroyed or captured by Soviet forces advancing from the east. This meant racing against time and against another ally whose objectives did not always align with British interests. Mission 11 took Peniakov and 6 men into the Austrian Alps, where German intelligence officers were reported to be destroying archives. They reached the target location to find it already burning. Peniakov salvaged what he could, including documents that would later prove valuable in understanding Soviet intelligence penetration of Balkan resistance movements. The 12th and final mission came on May 5, 1945, just 3 days before Germany's surrender. Peniakov was ordered to secure a chateau near Salzburg believed to contain high-value intelligence personnel. He arrived to find the chateau occupied by an SS unit that had not yet received surrender orders. rather than wait for reinforcements. Peniakov approached under a white flag and negotiated their surrender through a combination of accurate information about Germany's military collapse and the implicit threat that refusal would result in the chateau being surrounded and reduced by artillery. The SS officer in command agreed. Peniakov took custody of 17 prisoners and a cache of documents. It was his last operation of the war. Why he survived? The obvious question is how. 12 missions, each designed for expendable assets, each with casualty projections that assumed total loss or near total loss of personnel. Yet Peniakov and the core members of his unit survived them all. The answer lies not in luck, but in a distinctive operational philosophy that ran counter to conventional military doctrine. First, Peniakov refused to accept missions as written. But every assignment that came down from headquarters underwent what he called tactical revision. If the plan relied on speed, he modified it to emphasize stealth. If it required a specific route, he found an alternative. He understood that the enemy also read intelligence reports and could predict where raids were likely to occur. By systematically violating expectations, he created uncertainty that worked to his advantage. Second, he selected men not for physical prowess or combat experience, but for adaptability and initiative. Popsky's private army never exceeded 23 men at any given time. Every member could navigate by stars, repair vehicles under fire, speak at least 2 languages, and make independent tactical decisions. When missions went wrong, as they inevitably did, his men did not wait for orders. They improvised, adapted, and survived. Third, Peniakov understood that survival behind enemy lines required blending in. His unit used captured vehicles whenever possible, wore non-standard uniforms that could pass for civilian clothing at a distance, and avoided unnecessary combat. They were raiders, not commandos. Their objective was always to complete the mission and disappear, not to engage in heroic last stands. When firefights occurred, they were brief, brutal, and followed immediately by rapid withdrawal. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Peniakov maintained operational security through compartmentalization. Even within his own unit, men knew only what they needed to know for their specific role. If captured, they could not compromise missions they had no knowledge of. This principle extended to his relationship with British headquarters. He provided results but rarely detailed methods. This protected both his operational techniques and his sources of intelligence. Consequences and outcome: Popsky's private army was disbanded in September 1945. In 3 years of continuous operations, the unit had conducted dozens of raids, destroyed millions of pounds worth of Axis equipment, captured hundreds of prisoners, and provided intelligence that influenced strategic planning at the highest levels. Total casualties for the entire war: 3 men killed in action, 7 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. For a unit that specialized in suicide missions, these numbers represented a statistical impossibility that military analysts struggled to explain. Peniakov himself was awarded the Distinguished Service Order and mentioned in dispatches multiple times. And he wrote a memoir, published in 1950 as Private Army, that became a minor classic of military literature. He died in 1951 at the age of 54 from complications related to injuries sustained during the war. The cause was not dramatic. There was no final ambush, no heroic last stand. Just the accumulated damage of 3 years spent pushing human endurance past its breaking point. Why this event mattered in World War II? The significance of Popsky's private army extends beyond the tactical successes of individual missions. What Peniakov demonstrated was that small, highly trained units operating with near-total independence could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their size. This was not a new idea. Lawrence of Arabia had proven it in the First World War. The SAS and LRDG were proving it simultaneously in the Second. But Peniakov added something crucial: a systematic methodology for turning suicide missions into survivable operations. His operational principles influenced post-war development of Special Forces doctrine. The emphasis on small unit autonomy, cultural and linguistic training, use of unconventional tactics, and acceptance of calculated risk rather than reckless courage became foundational elements of modern special operations. When the British Special Air Service was reconstituted after the war, when American Special Forces were established in the 1950s, when every modern military developed its own elite units, the lessons learned from Popsky's private army were studied, analyzed, and incorporated. But perhaps the deeper significance lies in what his story reveals about the nature of impossible odds. 12 times. Military planners looked at a mission and concluded it could not be done. 12 times they sent Peniakov anyway, not because they expected success, but because the strategic objective was worth the sacrifice. 12 times he came back. That record stands not as evidence of superhuman ability, but as proof that the impossible is often just the improbable combined with insufficient imagination. Peniakov survived because he refused to accept the terms of engagement as presented. He rewrote the rules, changed the variables, and turned statistical certainty into reasonable risk. On a spring morning in 1951, Vladimir Peniakov died quietly in a London hospital. There was no state funeral, no grand memorial. The man they called Dead Man Walking simply stopped walking. But the 12 missions remain, documented in military archives, analyzed in staff colleges, studied by every generation of Special Forces operators who came after. 12 times into the fire. 12 times back out. Not through luck, not through miracles, through ruthless intelligence, careful planning, and the understanding that survival is not about being fearless. It is about being smarter than the people trying to kill you. In the end, that was Peniakov's real gift. He saw the pattern in the chaos, the weak point in every impossible situation, the one path through when everyone else saw only walls. And for 3 years of the most brutal war in human history, that was enough.